start by opening to the floor for any questions or comments. Please.
Anna, you might have covered this, but I'm not sure. So, to what extent is the ambiguity about the Spanish hours also kind of ambiguity about Americans' pronunciation, or is this also something that also
No, I did not do that, and that's a really great question because that gets into a lot of issues about is this spoken aloud, for example, is this intended for recitation, and what?
Well, but I think it's also
the mental process.
Yeah, like what a reader is hearing as a British or American reader too.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. That I think though that ours introduces the point of decision in an interesting way that might not necessarily be accent based, but that it is a point of sort of there is a history of lighting the syllable in ours prosodically, and so determining whether you're lining up with that history or if it's kind of a modern discussion about time standardization, or if it's a modern issue that's being dealt with. So yeah, there are a lot of like weird intersections happening right there, but thank you for that.
This is kind of a question for Yannig and Maiya in her relationship with Annelie. The body, through the body, you can argue, and I would argue that there's a different, a physical or physiological temporality that's not the same as mechanical universals of time. And then, if you accept the mind-body split, then you basically de-emphasize bodily time in order to synchronize the body into the mechanical time of homogenized time. So how does your emphasis on the body alter our understanding of time and temporality? Here, time and temporality can be a synonym for some kind of modern homogeneous epistemology.
Do you want to start, Maiya? Or?
Sure, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think what's useful about the body is that there's a certain flexibility in that kind of time. I think it opens out to multiple understandings of time and the way that things are experienced and embodied. What I think is very interesting is actually in the movement to train actors and to train the bodies of actors, it also sort of coincides with notions of organizing the body's time, sort of Taylorism and things like this. And so really in understanding the body, at least in theater, it was sort of, in a sense, made possible by the function of applying this kind of mechanistic theories to it. So that, in other words, first to kind of reveal the potential of the body to have a relationship to time, the first step was to actually kind of apply mechanistic time onto it, in my field at least. And so I think from there, as a first step, it also became a very constricting kind of way to think about the body. So from there, I think the move outward then was to say how, what are the other options in body time? And I think this kind of flexibility now is what's quite interesting. What kind of experience then would you base the time on? What sort of physical experience? And I think that it's kind of a moment of opening that out with a lot of sort of possibility, which I think is really interesting. So I don't think I have sort of a conclusive response to that, but rather just the sort of marking the moment of the openness to using that in relationship to time in the opposite direction.
I guess I should I say something to her? I think of three kind of connections between the body and time. One is, that the body occupies time, right? So if you raise your arm, that happens at a certain time. You lower it, that happens at another time. So that aspect of the way the body is in time, I think, is just the same as any other physical object. There's also, the experience of how your body's moving through time, which, is something different from kind of the physical facts about where in time these events are happening. To me, that experience is part of your inner life, and isn't so the body is what the experience is about, but the body doesn't enter into the experience sort of constitutively. It's like if you're thinking about the Eiffel Tower, right? We can talk about it, but it's not part of my thinking. It's what my thinking is about. Same thing. Okay, and then a third connection between the body and time, which is kind of to me in the same ballpark, is sort of the rhythm of how you move. So, right, part of the control you have over the body and the way you determine the way you physically act has to do with what you do when, what kind of rhythm your and timing your bodily actions have. That I think, at least for me, I would also think of that as a cognitive phenomenon where you're determining what your body does in time through cognitive processes, which aren't as such bodily. Sorry.
Boy, they both went up at the same time. Ladies first.
Can I ask Yannig about the neuromolecular biologization of analytical philosophy in more recent times? So that there's been an increasing movement in analytical philosophy of language to be more and more engaged with the neuromolecular biology of language and indeed cognition as a whole. And isn't there sort of did you leave that out of your kind of taxonomy of the absence of the body in philosophical thought? The most contemporary biologization of the philosophy of mind, or maybe you just disagree with that.
At least the bits of philosophy of mind that I know of that are that at least I associate with what you said, that are kind of materialist, reductive conceptions of mind. My own sense is that that's a relatively minority view in the philosophy of mind in this sort of analytic tradition. There's a lot of interest in the interaction between. So, right, the mind there are physical processes that underlie cognitive phenomena, but they're distinct. So a bunch of cells in your brain shoot some electricity, and that's a physical process that happens. It's associated with cognitive phenomena that, or aspects of mind like thinking, representing, conscious experience. All that stuff is closely connected to the underlying physical processes. And as far as I know, there's a lot of interest in that interaction, but the view that the cognitive, the mental, is to be identified with the physical processes is a kind of minority view, so the Churchlands. And anyway, so at least for me, when I think of the mind and the cognitive, the psychological, and all that, I don't have in mind these physical processes. I have in mind the mental as such.
And we had another question.
A question for Maiya. So, given the Luthra school's emphasis on surface and mind, I see your argument about the approach of embodied cognition as a theatrical training mechanism. But I'm wondering, in terms of this recalibration of kind of linguistic-based cognitive apparatus, the Cartesian moment and so forth, how does a Lecoqian approach help us think about linguistic theatrical performances? In other words, very strongly language-based theatrical activities.
Mm-hmm. The Lecoq perspective on that actually suggests, which is interesting, it's actually aligned with some of this minority neurobiologization.
The biologization.
Yes, a theory of mind, thank you. And so the Lecoq perspective in theater is that these sort of physical principles of that one learns through the process of identification that I shared with you all and other exercises is sort of the bedrock for dramatic creation, dramatic communication, and would suggest that language lives on top of it. Would suggest that any sort of successful, of course it's debatable, sort of language-based, text-based plays, theater, in the theater world is because somehow the physical principles are sort of seeping up from below in this bedrock, sort of making their way transposed into language. So it sees a kind of continuum, but really grounded in the physical, which is interesting because some of the folks in this camp as well, in this minority camp, also suggest that language, cognition, everything is based on physical processes, and he uses all sorts of models of sort of the baby in utero coming to know through moving. If they didn't move, they wouldn't develop these cognitive processes. So I think similarly in that way, it sort of sees that there is a continuum with body and mind, with physicality and thinking and language, and both of these sort of see sort of levels that seep up from the bottom through the actions of the body, and then move to higher, more cognitively, complex or abstract fields, which include sort of language and text.
This is perhaps more of a comment than a question, but I'll just kind of put it out there. In the last session, when there was a lot of discussion about the history of emotions, I was struck by the absence of any discussion about literature. And it seems to me, coming from literary studies, that the history of emotions really is to be found in literature. So I was very interested in your different perspectives, which really were raising that question of what it means to enter someone else's script, so to speak, whether it's to vocalize, to enter the speech of someone else, or to through performance, which I know is not always based on a text, but historically in history of theater is. And I would say, coming out of 18th century studies, that thinking about some of these discussions about the body, going back to say someone like Hume, that is very much in a literary tradition of a first-person narrative to try to describe the experience that the reader then has to enter into in some way. So I don't know if you have any comments about that, but it just seems that in trying to understand embodiment, embodied experience, identification, that one is talking about literature.
Oh, I'm a literature person. Yeah, I was struck by that too. I was thinking, well, here's our first person. Here, this is your account of emotions in these poems, right? The lyric is traditionally seen as the expression of emotion. So I don't do a lot of body stuff, but I was equally struck by that, and I think that.
Well, but you're talking about voice in a way. I mean, I know your subject was something else, but you're raising that question of, are you speaking these lines?
Right.
How do you actually give voice to them?
Yeah, the question about accent really brings up so much about what, and that is, I think, at its heart, scansion is supposed to provide us, it's supposed to guide us through proper pronunciation in a certain way, but the other sort of half of my project is really engaged in these prosodic debates that are going on, particularly at the turn of the century and mid-century. And I'm really engaged in issues of temporal prosody, and so much of that depends on already being able to properly pronounce English, such that you would then be, the correct speaker of English would be the correct pronouncer of the poem, for example, that there's some kind of like English ear that is appropriate to pronunciation. So that's in some ways the tradition that Eliot is working out of. So this question about accents is great, but the voice of the poem, we find so often that prosody isn't a great guide, that it doesn't give us all the answers, and so that's where we have a lot of, I think, breakdown about, well, what does this prosody tell us, or what does scansion reveal in a certain way, and it becomes a question of interpretation, I suggest.
Did you either of you want to comment on the comment, or? I think, yeah. Is it short?
Yes.
Okay, please.
I'm wondering if there are any vanishing points when the split between mind-body is suspended. For example, numbness or suffering. In other words, at what point does the cognitive alternative break down? Cognitive, because that's how you articulate it.
For me, where I would go is thinking, about animals lower on the food chain, and where, so when you're talking about organisms that are fairly basic, I mean, it seems like, right, at a certain level, you don't have, you're talking about bees or ants or something like that. There's something that's like cognition. I mean, right? They have some kind of representation of where they're going and where the hive is and so on, and they have perception that's cognitive and so on. So at least my own instinct in thinking about where the kind of mind physical difference starts to break down is if you kind of push that further and further back, are there kind of points in the spectrum of kind of cognitive, right?
Human experience.
Well, for me, it's well below that. You've got, I mean, if you've got vision, you've got a mind sort of proper, and you've got vision way before human experience. That'd be my own.
Quickly, there's a really interesting case of a man named Ian Waterman in neuroscience who lost all sense of where he is in space. So he was, he could function, but he couldn't sort of use his body, so he felt like a sort of floating head. And so what's interesting with him is in terms of his life and sort of using his body to move through the world and have a cognitive experience of the world, is he was able to sort of teach himself to do it visually. So what was interesting with Ian Waterman is it sort of demonstrates the ways in which, even at perhaps a vanishing point, in his situation, the body can kind of virtually make up for that to a certain extent, to a very low extent. He sort of couldn't move and live like a normal person, but through sort of visually monitoring his body at every stage, he could teach himself to walk and things like this. He's very, very exceptional. And they looked at his brain, and inside his brain, it looked like someone who was like a master juggler or something. And so I think what's interesting about these vanishing points are, and what's useful about neuroscience and cognitive science is they often found their work on the exception and sort of the anomaly, and sort of through the anomaly finding where those vanishing points are and how they may be negotiated.
All right, I think we have to end it. Thank you very much for excellent questions and wonderful presentations. And please, I guess we'll move into the adjoining room for the next set. You have 45. Thank you.